Last time, we established the problem. A word that appears exactly once in all of Greek literature, translated into vain repetitions by inserting another word that isn't in the text, used to condemn a practice that Yeshua himself employed 30 seconds later. That's not a minor translation footnote. That's a crack in the foundation. Tonight, we go through it, room by room. The traditional etymology traces Bata to King Battus I of Cyrene. Cyrene was a Greek colony in what is now Libya, approximately 800 miles from Jerusalem, across open Mediterranean Sea. Battus I ruled around 630 BC, 6.5 centuries before the Sermon on the Mount. Now, hold that in mind and consider who Jesus was speaking to. Fishermen, farmers, tax collectors, tradesmen, Roman soldiers on the margins of empire. People whose entire theological world was Torah, temple, and the oral traditions passed from father to son around a fire. Not Herodotus, not Pindar, not the archival records of a North African Greek colony most of them would have never heard of. Matthew provides zero explanation of the reference. No context, no, as you may recall from the reign of. Nothing. He drops the word as though every person present would immediately grasp its meaning. And this is where the traditional interpretation asks us to accept something remarkable. That a Galilean rabbi, speaking to common people in a thoroughly Jewish context, reached across 6 centuries and 800 miles to invoke an obscure Cyrenian monarch, and that his audience simply knew what he meant. Yeshua didn't teach that way. His parables are seeds and soil, lost coins, prodigal sons, imagery pulled from the lives his listeners were actually living. He never once assumed specialized knowledge his audience didn't have. The burden of proof for a Cyrenian reference is enormous, and it's never been met. Let's go directly to the text. Matthew 6:7 in Greek reads, "When praying, do not Battalogesete, just as the Gentiles do." That's it. That's the verse. Now, find the word vain in that sentence. It isn't there. Find the word empty. Also not there. The Greek word for vain, kenos, does not appear in this verse, not once, not implied, not hiding in a construction. It's simply absent. What does appear in the very next clause, polylogia, many words, much speaking. And even that describes what the Gentiles think will work, not what Battalogesete itself means. Vain repetitions, empty phrases, meaningless babble. Those are interpretations. They're not translations. Somewhere between the Greek manuscript and the English Pew Bible, a theological conclusion was embedded into the text itself. And once it was in, once the word vain was sitting there in print, in King James, in ESV, and NIV, no one questioned it. Because why would you question the translation of a word that appears nowhere else? You have nothing to compare it against. That is the peculiar danger of a hapax legomenon. It can bear almost any meaning you assign it. And what was assigned was babbling. But here's where the traditional interpretation doesn't just strain. Here's where it breaks. Let's actually meet Battus I of Cyrene, because if his name became a byword for hollow, faithless, manipulative prayer, we should understand who he was. Herodotus tells us, Battus, born Aristoteles, went to the oracle at Delphi, not for power, not for conquest. He went because he had a speech impediment, and he wanted to know if he would ever be healed. The oracle didn't answer his question. Instead, she gave him a calling. Go to Libya, plant a colony. And Battus said, Lord, I came about my speech. I've no army, no resources. I have no power for something like this. Where would I even begin? The oracle said, what you're gonna want to do is get a boat. So he went anyway. He failed initially. The colony struggled. After 2 years, he returned to Delphi. Not in defiance, but in faithfulness. Seeking clarity, asking again, and the oracle sent him back out. He went again. This time he planted roots. This time Cyrene took hold. This time the calling was fulfilled. A man, chosen despite his weakness of speech, who protested his calling honestly, who failed in return for guidance rather than giving up, who was obedient even when obedience was costly, who ruled with wisdom rather than violence when he finally arrived. That's not a cautionary tale. Here's the hard truth. The man whose name the traditional interpretation uses as a synonym for hollow, manipulative, faithless prayer was chosen by God because of his inadequacy, sent despite his weakness, honored through his persistence. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. Moses stood at the burning bush and said, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue. And God said, go. The traditional interpretation doesn't just fail linguistically. It accidentally slanders a figure who embodies the very character Scripture celebrates across both testaments. Every pillar, 6 centuries of temporal distance, 800 miles of geography, an audience with no access to Cyrenian history, a Greek word inserted into a text that never contained it, and at the foundation of the entire etymology, a man whose life reads like a prototype for the prophetic calling. Not a warning, a model. The traditional interpretation has stood for centuries, not because the evidence demands it. It stood because no one's offered anything better. Next time, someone does.